Good evening, survivors, and welcome to the end of the world. You're tuned into the Series 1 finale of Hitchcock's Tales That Terrified here on SL Tonight. I'm Felix Lubezki, and if you're wondering about the office decor, well, don't. Before we move on to our story, let's get into our sponsor. I hope it's a good one this time.
Guys, tired of being weak? Super strength, vitamins, one pill, and you'll feel unstoppable. Power up for the gym, the job, life. Feel the surge! Super strength! Real results, real fast.
It's working too good. My arms, they're growing.
Stop! No! My muscles are exploding! Help! Wrong ad! Cut it!
Cut it. Super strength. Super power. Forever.
Again? Sorry, folks. Apparently, it didn't take the tape out or something. Either way, moving on. Tonight, we conclude John Wyndham's masterpiece. We've seen the fireballs. We survived the sea tanks. The Phase 3? Phase 3 is where the aliens stop playing fair. They've gone for the ice caps. The world is melting, the cities are drowning, and the only thing higher than the tide is the human capacity for panic. It's the ultimate Hitchcockian nightmare, nature itself hijacked by an unseen hand, turning our own environment into a weapon. It's not just a battle for the shores anymore, it's a battle for a place to stand. Check your life jackets, the water is rising. The story begins now. Phase 3. Even though Barker had been unaware of it when he gave his warning, the new method of attack had already begun, but it took 6 months more before it became apparent. Had the ocean vessels been keeping their usual courses, it would have aroused general comment earlier, but with the transatlantic crossings taking place only by air, the pilots' reports of unusually dense and widespread fog in the West Atlantic were simply noted. With the increased range of aircraft, too, Gander had declined in importance so that its frequently fog-bound state caused little inconvenience. Checking reports at that time in the light of later knowledge, I discovered that there were reports about that same time of unusually widespread fogs in the northwestern Pacific, too. Conditions were bad off the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido, and said to be still worse off the Kurils further north. But since it was now some time since ships had dared to cross the deeps in those parts, information was scanty, and few were interested. Nor did the abnormally foggy conditions on the South American coast northward from Montevideo attract public attention. The chilly mistiness of the summer in England was, indeed, frequently remarked, though more than with resignation than surprise. Fog, in fact, was scarcely noticed by the wider world consciousness until the Russians mentioned it. A note from Moscow proclaimed the existence of an area of dense fog, having its center on the meridian of 130 degrees east of Greenwich, at which, or about, the 85th parallel. The Soviet scientists, after research, had declared that nothing of the kind was on previous record, nor was it possible to see how the known conditions in those parts could generate such a state, let alone maintain it virtually unchanged for 3 months after its existence had first been observed. The Soviet government had on several former occasions pointed out that the Arctic activities of the hirelings of occasions capitalist warmongers might well be menaced to peace. The territorial rights of the USSR in that area of the Arctic lying between the meridian of 32 degrees east and 168 degrees west of Greenwich were recognized by international law. The Soviet government had on several former occasions pointed out that the Arctic activities of hirelings and capital warmongers might well be a menace to peace. Yeah, I lost my place. The territorial rights of the USSR in the area of the Arctic lying between the meridians of 32 degrees east and 168 degrees west of Greenwich were recognized by international law. That's what it was. Any unauthorized incursion into that area constitutes an aggression. The Soviet government therefore considered itself at liberty to take any action necessary for the preservation of peace in that region. They started off so well. The note, delivered simultaneously to several countries, received its most rapid and downright reply from Washington. The peoples of the West, State Department observed, would be interested by the Soviet note, as however they had now had considerable experience of that technique of propaganda, which had been called the prenatal Kwakwa, they were able to recognize its implications. The government of the United States was well aware of the territorial divisions in the Arctic. It would indeed remind the Soviet government, in the interest of accuracy, that the segment mentioned in the note was only approximate, the true figures being 32 degrees, 4 degrees longitude, 35 degrees latitude east of Greenwich, and 168 degrees, 49 latitude, 30 longitude. I do not know how those readings go. Something. West of Greenwich, giving a slightly smaller segment than that claimed, but since the center of the phenomena mentioned was well within this area, the United States government had naturally no cognizance of its existence until informed of it in the note. I believe it's 32 degrees 4 latitude, 35 longitude, 168 degrees 49 latitude, 30 longitude. Recent observations had curiously recorded the existence of just such a feature as that described in the note at a center as close to the 85th parallel, but at a point 79 degrees west of Greenwich. By coincidence, that was just the target area jointly selected by the United States and Canadian governments for tests of their latest types of long-range guided missiles. Preparations for these tests had already been completed, and the first experimental launchings would take place in a few days. The Russians commented on the quaintness of choosing a target area where observation was not possible. The Americans, upon the Slavonic zeal for pacification of uninhabited regions. Whether both parties then proceeded to attack their respective fogs is not on public record, but the wider effect was that the fogs became news and were discovered to have been unusually dense in a surprising number of places. Had weather ships had still been at work in the Atlantic, it is likely that useful data would have been gathered sooner, but they had been temporarily withdrawn from service, following the sinking of two of them some time before. Consequently, the first report which did anything to tidy up the idle speculation came from Godstad in Greenland. It spoke of an increased flow of water through the Davis Strait from Baffin Bay, with a content of broken ice quite unusual for the time of year. A few days later, Nome, Alaska, reported a similar condition in the Bering Strait. Then from Spitsbergen, too, came reports of increased flow and lower temperature. That straightforwardly explained the fogs off Newfoundland and certain other parts. Elsewhere, they could be convincingly ascribed to deep-running cold currents forced upwards into the warmer waters above the by encounters with submarine mountain ranges. Everything, in fact, could be either simply or obtrusively explained, except the unusual increase in the cold flow. Then from Godhavn, north of Godthaab, on the West Greenland coast, a message told of icebergs in unprecedented numbers and often at unusual size. Investigating expeditions were flown from American Arctic bases and confirmed the report. The sea in the north of Baffin Bay, then announced, was crammed with icebergs. At about latitude 77 degrees 60 degrees west, one of the players wrote, we found the most awesome sight in the world. The glaciers which run down from the high Greenland ice cap were calving. I've seen icebergs formed before, but never on anything like the scale it is taking place there. In the great ice cliffs, hundreds of feet high, cracks appear suddenly. An enormous section tilts out, falling and turning slowly. When it smashes into the water, the spray rises up in great fountains, spreading far out all around. The displaced water comes rushing back in breakers which clash together in tremendous spray, while a berg as big as a small island slowly rolls and wallows and finds its balance. For 100 miles up and down the coast, we saw splashes starting up where the same thing was happening. Very often a berg had no time to float away before a new one had crashed down on top of it. The scale was so big that it was hard to realize. Only by the apparent slowness of the falls and the way the huge splashes seemed to hang in the air, the majestic pace of it, we were able to tell the vastness of what we were seeing. Just so did other expeditions describe the scene on the east coast of Devon Island and on the southern tip of Ellesmere Island. In Baffin Bay, the innumerable great bergs jostled slowly, grinding the flanks and shoulders from one another as they herded on the long drift southward through the Davis Strait and out into the Atlantic. Away over on the other side of the Arctic Circle, Nome announced that southward flow of broken pack ice had further increased. But the public received information in a cushionly style. People were impressed by the first magnificent photographs of icebergs in the process of creation. But, although no iceberg is quite like any other iceberg, the generic similarity is pronounced. A rather brief period of awe was succeeded by the thought that while it was really very clever of science to know all about icebergs and climate and so on, it did not seem to be much good knowing if it could not resultantly do something about it. The dreary summer passed into drearier autumn. There seemed to be nothing anybody could do about it except be a grumbling philosophy. At the other end of the world, spring came, then summer, and the whaling season started, insofar as it could be called a season at all, when the owners would risk ships were so few, and the crews ready to risk their lives fewer still. Nevertheless, some could be found ready to dam the bathies, along with other perils of the deep, and set out. At the end of the Antarctic summer came news, via New Zealand, of glaciers in Victoria Land shedding huge quantities of bergs into the Ross Sea, and suggestions that the Great Ross Ice Barrier itself might be beginning to break up. Within a week came similar news from the Weddell Sea. The Filchner Barrier there and the Larsen Ice Shelf were both said to be calving bergs in fantastic numbers. A series of reconnaissance flights brought in reports which read almost exactly like those from Baffin Bay, and photographs which might have come from the same region. The Sunday tidings, which had for some years been pursuing a line of intellectual sensationalism, had never found it easy to maintain its supply of material. But the policy was subject to lamentable gaps during which it could find nothing topical on its chosen level to disclose. The Sunday tidings, which had some years been pursuing a line of intellectual sensationalism, had never found it easy to maintain its supply of material. The policy was subject to lamentable gaps during which it could find nothing topical on its chosen level to disclose. It must, one fancies, have been a counsel of desperation over a prolonged hiatus of the kind which induced it to open its columns to Barker. That the editor felt some apprehension over the result was discernible from his italicized note preceding the article in which he disclaimed, on grounds of fair-mindedness, any responsibility for which he was now printing in his own paper. With its auspicious beginning, and under the heading, The Devil and the Deeps, Barker lit off. Never since the days when Noah was building his ark has there been such a well-regimented turning of blind eyes as during the last year. It cannot go on. Soon, now, the whole Arctic night will be over. Observation will again be possible. Then the eyes that should never have been shut must open. That beginning I remember, but without references I can only give the gist and a few recollected phrases of the rest. This, Bakker continued, is the latest chapter in a long tale of futility and failure stretching back to the sinkings of Yatsushiro and Kuina and beyond. Failure, which has already driven us from the seas, now threatens us on the land. I repeat, failure. That is a word so little to our taste that many think it is a virtue to claim that they never admit it. All about us are unrest, inflating prices, whole economic structures changing, and therefore a way of life that is changing. All about us, too, are people who talk about our exclusion from the high seas as though it were some temporary inconvenience soon to be corrected. To this smugness there is a reply. To this there is a reply. It is this. For over 5 years now, the best, the most agile, the most inventive brains in the world have wrestled with the problem of coming to grips with their enemy, and there is, on their present findings, nothing at all to indicate that we shall ever be able to sail the seas in peace again. For the word failure is so wry in our mouths, it has apparently been policy to discourage any expression of the connection between our maritime troubles and the recent developments in the Arctic and Antarctic. It's time for the attitude of not before the children to cease. I do not suggest that the root problem is being neglected, far from it. There have been and are men wearing themselves out to find some means by which we can locate and destroy the enemy in our deeps. What I do say is that with them still unable to find a way, we now face the most serious assault yet. It is an assault against which we have no defenses. It is not susceptible of direct attack. What is this weapon to which we can oppose no counter? It is the melting of the Arctic ice, and a great part of the Antarctic ice too. You think that fantastic? Too colossal? It is not. It is a task which we could have undertaken ourselves had we so wished at any time since we released the power of the atom. Because of the winter darkness, little has been heard lately of the patches of Arctic fog. It is not generally known that though two of them existed in the Arctic spring, by the end of the Arctic summer there were 8 in widely separated areas. Now, fog is caused, as you know, by the meeting of hot and cold currents of either air or water. How does it happen that 8 novel, independent, warm currents can suddenly occur in the Arctic? And the results? Unprecedented flows of broken ice into the Bering Sea and into the Greenland Sea. In these two areas particularly, the pack ice is hundreds of miles north of its usual spring maximum. In other places, the north of Norway, for instance, is further south. And we ourselves have had an unusually cold, wet winter. And the icebergs? Obviously, there are a great many more icebergs than usual, but why should there be more icebergs? Everyone knows where they're coming from. Greenland is a large island, greater than 9 times the size of the British Isles. But it is more than that. It is also the last great bastion of the retreating ice age. Several times ice has come south, grinding and scouring, smoothing the mountains, scooping the valleys on its way until it stood in huge ramparts, dizzy cliffs of glass green ice, vast slow-crawling glaciers across half Europe. Then it went back, gradually, over centuries, back and back. The huge cliffs and mountains of ice dwindled away, melted, and were known no more, except in one place. Only in Greenland does that immemorial ice still tower 9,000 feet high, unconquered yet, and down its sides slide the glaciers which spawn the icebergs. They have been scattering their icebergs into the sea, season after season, since before there was been to know of it. And why, in this year, should they suddenly spawn 10, 20 times as many? There must be a reason for this. There is. If some means or some several means of melting the Arctic ice were put into operation, a little time would have to pass before its effect, namely the rise of the sea level, became measurable. Moreover, the effects would be progressive, first a trickle, then a gush, then a torrent. In this connection, I draw attention to the fact that in January this year, the mean sea level of Newland, where it is customarily measured, was reported to have risen by 2½ inches. "Oh dear," said Phyllis when she had read this. "Of all the pertinacious stickers out of necks, we'd better go and see him." It did not entirely surprise us when we telephoned the next morning to find that his number was not available. When we called, however, we were admitted. Bakker got up from a desk littered with mail to greet us. "Well, worth a good you coming here," he told us. "There is no sponsor to touch me with a 40-foot pole." Oh, I'd say not that, A.B., Phyllis told him. You will very likely find yourself immensely popular with the sellers of sandbags and makers of earth-shifting machinery before long. He took no notice of that. You'd probably be contaminated if you associate with me. In most countries, I'd be under arrest by now. Terribly disappointing for you. This has always been discouraging territory for ambitious martyrs. But you do try, don't you? He responded. Now, look, A.B., she went on. Do you really like to have people throwing things at you, or what is it? I get impatient, said the doctor. So do other people, but nobody I know has quite your gift for going just beyond what people are willing to take at any given moment. One day you'll get hurt. Not this time, because luckily you've messed it up, but one time certainly. If not this time, then probably not at all, he said. He bent a thoughtful, disapproving look at her. Just what do you mean, young woman, by coming here and telling me I messed it up? The anticlimax. First you sounded as if you were on the point of great revelations, but then that was followed by a rather vague suggestion that somebody or something must be causing the Arctic changes, without any specific explanation of how it could be done. And then your grand finale was that the tide is 2.5 inches higher. Parker continued with a regard. Well, so it is. I don't see what's wrong with that. 2.5 inches is a colossal amount of water when it's spread over 141 million square miles. If you reckon it up to tons, I never reckon water in tons, and that's part of the point. For ordinary people, 2.5 inches just means a very slightly higher mark on the coast. If you build it up, it sounds like such a letdown that everyone feels annoyed with you for alarming them. Then those that don't just laugh and say, "Ha ha, those professors." Walker waved his hand at the desk with its load of mail. But a lot of people have been alarmed, or at least indignant, he said. He lit a cigarette. That was what I wanted. You know that at every stage the great majority, and particularly the authorities, have resisted the evidence as long as they could. This is a scientific age, in a more educated strata. It will therefore almost fall over backwards in disregarding the abnormal, and it has developed a deep suspicion in its own senses. Very reluctantly, the existence of something in the deeps was belatedly conceded. There has been equal reluctance to admit all the succeeded manifestations until they couldn't be dodged. And now here we are again, balking at the newest hurdle. We've not been altogether idle, though. The Arctic Ocean is deep and even more difficult to get at than the others, though there was some bombing where the fog patches occurred, but the double of it is there's no way of telling results. In the middle of it, the Muscovite, who seemed to be constitutionally incapable of understanding anything to do with the sea, started making trouble. The sea, he appeared to be arguing, was causing a great deal of inconvenience to the West, therefore it must be acting on good, dialectically materialistic principles. I have no doubt that if he could contact the deeps, he would like to make a pact with their inhabitants for a brief period of dialectical opportunities. Anyway, he led off, as you know, with accusations of aggression, and then, in the back and forth that followed, began to show such truculence that the attention of our services became diverted from the really serious threat to the antics of this Oriental clown who thinks the sea was only created to embarrass capitalists. Thus, we have now arrived at a situation where the Bathies, as they call them, far from falling down on the job as we'd hoped, are going ahead fast, and all the brains and organizations that should be working full speed at planning to meet the emergency are continually fooling around with those ills they have, and ignoring others that they would rather not know of. So you decided the time has come to force their hands by, blowing the gaff? I asked. Yes, but not alone. This time I had the company of a number of eminent and very worried men. Mine were only an opening shot at the wider public on this side of the Atlantic. My weighty companions, who have not already lost their reputations over this business, are working more subtly. As to the American end, well, just take a look at Life and Collier's this next week. Oh, yes, something is going to be done. What? Asked Phyllis. He looked at her thoughtfully for a moment and then shook his head slightly. That, thank God, is someone else's department. At least it will be when the public forces them to admit the situation. It's going to be a very bloody business, he said seriously. What I want to know, Phyllis and I began, simultaneously. Your turn, Mike, she offered. Well, mine is, how do you think the thing's being done? Melting the Arctic seems a pretty formidable proposition. There have been a number of guesses. They range from incredible operations like pipe warming water up from the tropics to tapping Earth's central heat, which I find just about as unlikely. But you have your own idea? I suggested. It seemed improbable that he had not. Well, I think it might be done this way. We know that they have some kind of device that will project a jet of water with considerable force. Bottom sediment that was washed up in the surface currents in a continuous flow pretty well proved that. Well, then a contraption of that kind, used in conjunction with a heater, say an atomic reaction pile, ought to be capable of generating quite a considerable warm current. The obvious snag there is that we don't know whether they have atomic fission or not. So far, there's been no indication that they have, unless you count on presenting them with at least one atomic bomb that didn't go off. But if they do have it, I think that might be an answer. They could get the necessary uranium? Why not? After all, they have forcibly established their rights, mineral and otherwise, over more than two-thirds of the world's surface. Oh yes, they could get it all right if they know about it. And the iceberg angle? That's less difficult. In fact, there's pretty general agreement that if one has a vibratory type of weapon, which their attacks on ships led us to believe they had, there ought to be no great difficulty in causing a lump of ice, even a considerable sized lump of ice, to crack. Suppose we can't find a way of hindering the process. How long do you think it'll take before we're in real trouble? I asked him. He shrugged. I have absolutely no idea. As far as the glaciers and ice cap are concerned, it presumably depends on how hard they work at it. But directing warm currents on pack ice would presumably show only small results to begin with, and they increase rapidly, very likely to be geometrical progression. Worse than useless to guess, but with no data at all. Once this gets into people's heads, they're going to want to know the best thing to do, Phyllis said. What would you advise? You know, the government's job? It's because it's high time they thought about doing something advising that we'd blown the gaff, as Mike put it. And my own personal advice is too impracticable to be worth much. What is it? Phyllis asked. Find a nice, self-sufficient hilltop, fortify it, said Bacher. The campaign did not get off to a resounding start that Bacher had hoped. In England, it had the misfortune to be adopted by the Nethermore press and was consequently regarded as stunt territory, wherein it would be unethical for other journalistic feats to trespass. In America, it did not stand out greatly among the other excitements of the week. In both countries, there were interests which preferred that it should seem to be no more than a stunt. France and Italy took it more seriously, but their government's political weight in the World Councils was lighter. Russia ignored the content, but explained the purpose. It was yet another move by cosmopolitan fascist warmongers to extend their affluence in the Arctic. Nevertheless, official indifference was slightly breached, Bacher assured us. A committee on which the services were represented had been set up to inquire and make recommendations. A similar committee in Washington also inquired in a leisurely fashion until it was brought up sharply by the state of California. The average Californian was not greatly worried by a rise of a couple inches in the tide level. He had been much more delicately stricken. Something was happening to his climate. The average of his seaboard temperature had gone way down and he was having cold, wet fog. He disapproved of that, and a large number of Californians disapprovingly made quite a noise. Oregon and Washington, too, rallied to support their neighbor. Never within the compass of their statistical records had there been so cold and unpleasant a winter. It was clear to all parties that the increased flow of ice and cold water pouring out of the Bering Sea was being swept eastward by the Kuroshio current from Japan, and obvious to at least one of the parties that the enemies of the most important state in the Union were suffering greatly. Something must be done. In England, the spur was applied when April spring tides overflowed the embankment wall of Westminster. Assurances that this had happened a number of times before was devoid of particular significance were swept aside by the triumphant "we told you so" of the Nethermore press. A hysterical bomb the Vathies demand sprang up on both sides of the Atlantic and spread round the world, except for the extranjant sixth. Furthermore, as well as first in the Bomb the Bathies movement, the Nethermore press inquired morning and evening, what is the bomb for? Billions have been spent upon this bomb, which appears to have no other destiny but to be held up and shaken threateningly, or from time to time to provide pictures for our illustrated papers. The people of the world who evolved and paid for this weapon are now forbidden to use it against the menace that has sunk our ships, closed our oceans, snatched men and women from our very shores, and now threatens to drown us. Procrastination and ineptitude has from the beginning marked the attitude of the authorities in this affair, and so on with the earlier bombings of the deeps apparently forgotten by writers and readers alike. Looking up nicely now, said Barker when we saw him next. It seemed pretty silly to me, Phyllis told him bluntly. All the same old arguments against indiscriminate bombings in deep still apply. Oh, not that part, Barker said. They'll probably drop a few bombs here and there with plenty of publicity and no results. No, I mean the urge towards planning. We're now in the first stage of stupid suggestions like building immense levees of sandbags, of course, but it's getting across that something has got to be done. It got across still more strongly after the next spring tide. There had been a strengthening of the sea defenses everywhere. In London, the riverside walls had been reinforced and topped for their whole width with sandbags. As a precaution, traffic had been diverted from the embankment, but the crowd turned out to throng it, and the bridges on foot. The police did their best to keep them moving, but they dawdled from one point to another, watching the slow rise of the water, waving to the crews of passing tugs and barges, which were presently riding above the roadway. They seemed equally ready to be indignant if the water should break through, or if disappointed if there were an anticlimax. They were not disappointed. The water lapped slowly above the parapet and against the sandbags. Here and there it began to trickle through onto the pavement. Firemen, civil defense, and police watched their sections anxiously, pushing bags to reinforce wherever a trickle enlarged, throwing up weak-looking spots of timber strut. The pace gradually became hotter. Bystanders began to help, dashing from one point to another as new jets started up. Presently there could be little doubt of what was going to happen. Some of the watching crowd withdrew, but many of them remained in a wavering fascination. When the breakthrough came, it occurred in a dozen places on the north bank almost simultaneously. Among the spurting jets, a bag or two would begin to shift, then suddenly came a collapse, and a gap several yards wide through which the water poured as if it were a dam. From where we stood on top of the EBC van parked on Vauxhall Bridge, we were able to see three separate rivers of muddy water pouring in the streets of Westminster, filling basements and cellars as they went, presently merging into one flood. Our commentator handed over another, perched on a Polemico roof. For a minute or two, we switched over to the BBC to find out how their crew on Westminster Bridge was faring. We got on to them just in time to hear Bob Humbley describing the flooded Victoria Embankment, with the water now rising against Scotland Yard's own second line of defense. The television boys didn't seem to be doing too well. There must have been a lot of bets lost on where the breakthrough would occur, but they were putting up a struggle with the help of telephoto lenses and portable cameras. From that point on, the things got thick and fast. On the south bank, water was breaking in the streets of Lambeth, Southwark, and Bermondsey in a number of places. Upriver, it was seriously flooding Chiswick. Downriver, the Limehouse was getting it badly, and more places kept on reporting breaks until we lost track of them. There was little to be done but stand by the tide to drop and then rush the repairs against it in the next rise. The house outquestioned any quiz. The replies were more assured than assuring. The relevant ministries and departments were actively taking all the steps necessary. Claims should be submitted through local consuls. Priorities of men and materials had already been arranged. Yes, warnings had been given, but unforeseen factors had intruded upon the hydrographers' calculations. An order and council would be made for the requisition of all earth-moving machinery. The public could have full confidence there would be no repetition of the calamity, and the measures already put in hand would ensure against any further extinction. Little could be done beyond rescue work in the eastern counties at present. That would, of course, continue, but the most urgent matter at the moment was to ensure that the water could make no further inroads at the next high tide. The requisition of materials, machines, and manpower was one thing. The apportionment with every seaboard community and low-tide area clamoring for them simultaneously quite another. Clerks and half a dozen ministries grew pale and heavy-eyed in a welter of demands, allocations, adjustments, redirections, misdirections, stubborn ornaments, and downright death. But somehow, in some places, things began to get done. Already there was a great bitterness between those who were chosen and those who looked like it were being thrown to the wolves. Phyllis went down one afternoon to look at progress on the work on the riverside. Amid great activity on both banks, superstructure of concrete blocks was arising on the existing walls. The sidewalk and supervisors were out in their thousands to watch. Among them, she chanced upon Barker. Together they ascended to Waterloo Bridge, and watched the termite-like activity with a celestial eye for a while. Out the sacred river and more than twice 5 miles of walls and towers, Phyllis observed. And there are going to be some deep but not very romantic chasms on either side, too, said Barker. I wonder how high they'll go before the futility comes home to them. Difficult to believe that anything on such a scale as this can be really futile, but I suppose you're right, Phyllis. They continued to regard the medley of men and machinery down below for a time. Well, Barker remarked at length, there must be at least one figure among the shades who is getting a hell of a good laugh out of this. Nice to think there's even one, Phyllis said. Who? King Canute, said Barker. We were having so much news of their own at the time that the effects in America found little room in newspapers, already straightened by his paper shortage. Newscasts, however, told that they were having their own troubles over there. California's climate was no longer problem number one. In addition to the difficulties of refracting ports and seaboard cities all over the world, there was bad coastline trouble in the south of the United States. It ran almost all the way around the Gulf from the Key West to the Mexican border. In Florida, owners of the real estate began to suffer once again as the Everglades and swamps spilled across more and more country. Across in Texas, the large tract of land north of Brownsville were gradually disappearing beneath the water. Still worse hit were Louisiana and the Delta. The enterprise of the Tin Pan Alley considered an appropriate time to revive the plea, river, stay away my door, but the river did not, nor over the Atlantic coast did other rivers in Georgia and the Carolinas. But it is idle to particularize. All over the world the threat was the same. The chief difference was that in more developed countries, all available earth-shifting machinery worked day and night, while in the more backward it was sweating thousands of men and women to toiled to raise great levees and walls. But for both the task was too great. The more the level rose, the further the defenses had to be extended to prevent outflanking. When the rivers were backed up by the incoming tides, there was nowhere for the water to go but over the surrounding countryside. All the time, too, the problems of preventing flooding from the river by water backed up in sewers and conduits became more difficult to handle. Even before the first serious inundation which followed the breaking of the embankment wall near Blackfriars in October, the man in the street had suspected that the battle could not be won, and the exodus of those with wisdom and the means had already started. Many of them, moreover, were finding themselves forestalled by the refugees from the eastern counties and the more vulnerable coastal towns elsewhere. Some little time before the Blackfriars breakthrough, a confidential note had circulated among selected staff and contracted personnel, such as ourselves, at EBC. It had been decided as a matter of policy, in the interest of public morale, we learned that should certain emergency measures become necessary, etc., and so on for 2 foolscap pages, and most of the information between the lines. It would have been a lot simpler to say, look, the word is that this thing's going to get serious. BBC has orders to stay put, so for prestige reasons we'll have to do the same. We want volunteers to man a station here. If you care to be one of them, we'll be glad to have you. Suitable arrangements will be made. There'll be a bonus and you can trust us to look after you okay if anything does happen. How about it? Phyllis and I took the note. If we had had any family, we decided, necessity would have been the best we could do by then, insofar as anyone could know that might turn out to be best. As we had not, we could please ourselves. Phyllis summed up for staying on the job. Apart from conscience and loyalty and all the proper things, she said, goodness knows what's going to happen in other places if it does really get bad. Somehow running away seldom seems to work out well unless you have a pretty good idea of what you're running to. My vote is for sticking and seeing what happens. So we sent our names in and we were pleased to find that Freddie Whittier and his wife had done the same. After that, some clever departmentalism had made seem as nothing were happening for a while. Several weeks passed before we got wind of the fact that EBC had leased the top 2 floors of a large department store near the Marby Arch and were working full speed to have them converted into as near a self-supporting station as possible. I should have thought, said Phyllis, when we acquired this information, that somewhere higher, like Hampstead or Highgate, would have been better. Neither of them is quite London, I pointed out. Besides, EBC probably gets it for a nominal rent for announcing each time. This is the EBC calling the world from the Selvages. Goodwill advertising during the interlude of emergency. Just as if the water would just go away one day, she said. Even if they don't think so, they'll lose nothing by letting EBC have it, I pointed out. By that time, we were becoming highly level conscious, and I looked the place up on the map. The 75-foot contoured line ran down the street on the building's western side. How does that compare with their rival? Wondered Phyllis, running her finger across the map. The broadcasting house appeared to be very slightly better off, about 85 feet above mean sea level, we judged. She said. Well, if there's any calculation behind her being on the top floor, they'll be having to do a lot of moving upstairs. Gosh, she added, glancing over the left of the map. Look at their television studios, right down at the 25-foot level. In the weeks just before the breakthrough, London seemed to be living a double life. Organizations and institutions were making their preparations as little ostentation as possible. Officials spoke in public with an effective casualness of the need to make plans, just in case, and then went back to their offices to work feverishly on the arrangement. Announcements continued to be reassuring in tone. The men employed on the jobs were, for the most part, cynical about their work, glad of the overtime pay, and curiously disbelieving. They seemed to regard it as a stunt, which was working nicely to their benefit. Imagination apparently refused to credit the threat with any reality outside working hours. Even after the first breakthrough, alarm was oddly localized with those who had suffered. The wall was hurriedly repaired, and the exodus was still not much more than a trickle of people. Real trouble came with the next spring tide. There were plenty of warning this time, and the parts likely to be most effective. The people took it stubbornly and phlegmatically. They had already had experience delaying by it. The main response was to move possessions to upper stories and grumble loudly at the inefficiency of the authorities who were incapable of saving them the trouble involved. Notices were posted giving them times of high water for 3 days, but the suggested precautions were couched in such a fear of promoting panic that they were little heeded. The first day passed safely. On the evening of the highest water, a large part of London settled down to wait for midnight and the crisis to pass, and a sullenly bad-tempered mood. The buses were all off the streets, and the underground had ceased to run at 8 in the evening. But plenty of people stayed out and walked down the river to see what was there that was to be seen from the bridges. They had their show. The smooth, oily surface crawled slowly up the piers of the bridges and against the retaining walls. The muddy water flowed upstream, scarcely a sound, and the crowds, too, were almost silent, looking down on it apprehensively. There was no fear of topping the walls. The estimated rise was 23 feet, 4 inches, which would leave a safety margin of 4 feet to the top of the new parapet. It was pressure that was the source of anxiety. From the north end of Waterloo Bridge, where we were stationed this time, one was able to look upon the wall along the top of the wall, with the water running high on one side of it, and to the other the roadway of the embankment, with the street lamp still burning there, but not a vehicle or a human figure to be seen upon. Away to the west, the hands on the Parliament clock tower crawled round the illuminated dial. The water rose as the big hand moved with an insufferable sloth up to 11 o'clock. Over the quiet crowds, the note of Big Ben striking the hour came clearly downwind. The sound caused people to murmur to one another, then they fell silent. The hand began to crawl down, 10 past, a quarter, 20, 25, then just before the half hour there was a rumble somewhere upstream. A composite, crowd-voiced sound came to us on the wind. People about us craned their necks and murmured again. A moment later we saw the water coming. It poured along the embankment toward us in a wide, muddy flood, sweeping rubbish and bushes with it, rushing past beneath us. A groan went up from the crowd. Suddenly there was a loud crack and a rumble of falling masonry behind us as a section of wall close by where Discovery had formerly been moored collapsed. The water poured through the gap, wrenching away concrete blocks so that the walls crumbled before our eyes, and the water poured in a great muddy cascade onto the roadway. Before the next tide came, the government had removed the velvet glove. Following the announcement of a state of emergency came a standstill order and the proclamation of an orderly scheme of evacuation. There's no need for me to write here the delays and muddies in which the scheme broke down. It's difficult to believe that it can be taken seriously even by those who launched it. An unconvincing air seemed to hang over the whole affair from the beginning. The task was impossible. Something, perhaps, might have been done had only a single city been concerned, but with more than two-thirds of the country's population anxious to move to higher ground, only the crudest methods had any success in checking the pressure, and then not for long. But though it had been bad here, it was still worse elsewhere. The Dutch had withdrawn in time from the danger areas, realizing that they had lost their centuries-long battle with the sea. The Rhine and the Maas had backed up in flood over square miles of country. The whole population was stretching southward into Belgium or southeast into Germany. The North German plain itself was a little better off. The Eddies and the Weiser had widened out too, driving people southward from their towns and farms up the shore. In Denmark, every kind of boat was used and ferrying families to Sweden and Ireland there. For a little time, we managed to follow in a general way that was happening. But when the inhabitants of the Ardennes and the Westphalia turned in dismay to save themselves by fighting off the hungry, desperate invaders in the north, hard news disappeared in a morass of rumor and chaos. All over the world, the same kind of thing must have been going on, differing only in its scale. At home, the flooding of the eastern counties had already driven people back on the Midlands. Loss of life was small, for there had been plenty of warning. The trouble started on the Chiltern Hills, where those already in possession organized themselves to prevent being swamped by the two converging streams of refugees from the east and from London. Over the untouched parts of central London, a mood of Sunday-like indecision hung for 7 days. Many people, not knowing what else to do, still tried to carry on as nearly as usual. The police continued to patrol. Though the underground was flooded, plenty of people continued to turn up at their places of work, and some kinds of work did continue, seemingly through habit or momentum. Then gradually lawlessness seeped inward from the suburbs, and the sense of breakdown became inescapable. Failure of the emergency electric supply one afternoon, followed by a night of darkness, gave a kind of coup de grace to order. The looting of shops, particularly food shops, began to spread on a scale which included both the police and the military. We decided it was time to leave the flat and take up our residence in the new EBC fortress. From what the shortwaves were telling us, there was little to distinguish the course of events in low-lying cities anywhere, except that in some the law died more quickly. It is outside my scope to dwell on the details. I have no doubt that they will be described later in any remote history. EBC's part during those days consisted largely in duplicating the BBC, treating out its hopefully intended to restore the monotonous business of telling those whose homes were not immediately threatened stay where they were and directing the flooded out to certain higher areas and away from others that were said to be already overcrowded. We may have heard, but we could have seen no evidence that we were heeded. In the north there may have been some effect, but in the south the hugely disproportionate concentration of London, and the flooding of so many rails and roads, ruined all attempts at orderly dispersal. The numbers of people in motion spread alarm among those who could have waited. The feeling that unless one reached a refuge ahead of the main crowd there might be no place at all to go was watching, as also was the feeling that anyone trying to do so by car was in possession of an unfair. It quickly became safer to walk wherever one was going, though not outstandingly safe at all. It is best to go out as little as possible. The existence of numerous hotels and reassuring elevation of some 700 feet above normal sea level were undoubted factors which influenced Parliament in choosing the town of Harrogate in Yorkshire as its seat. The speed with which it assembled there was very likely due to the same force as was motivating many private persons, fear that someone else might get in first. To an outsider it seemed that the bare few hours after Westminster was flooded, the ancient institution was performing with all its usual fluency in its new home. As for ourselves, we began to shake down into a routine. Our living quarters were on the top floor, offices, studios, technical equipment, generators, stores, etc. on the floor beneath. A great reserve of diesel oil and petrol filled large tanks in the basement, whence it was pumped as necessary. Our aerial systems were on roofs 2 blocks away, reached by bridges slung high over the intervening streets. Our own roof was largely cleared to provide a helicopter landing and to act as a rainwater catchment. As we gradually developed the technique for living there, we decided it was pretty secure. Even so, my recollection is that nearly all spare time in the first few days was spent by everyone in transferring the contents of the provision department to our own quarters before it should disappear elsewhere. There seems to have been a basic misconception of the role we should play. As I understood it, the idea was that we would preserve, as far as possible, the impression of business as usual, and then, as things grew more difficult, the center of EBC would follow the administration in gradual stages to Yorkshire. The appears to have been founded upon the assumption that London was so thoroughly constructed that as the water flowed into each cell, it would be abandoned while the rest carried on much as usual. As far as we were concerned, bands, speakers, and artists would all roll up to do their stuff in the ordinary way until the water lapped our doorsteps, if it should ever reach as far, by the time they would presumably have changed to the habit of rolling up to the Yorkshire Station instead. The only provision on the program side that anyone had made for things not happening in a naive fashion was a transfer of a recorded library before it became actually necessary to save it. A dwindling, rather than a breakdown, was envisaged. Curiously, quite a number of conscientious broadcasters did somehow manage to put in their appearances for a few days. After that, however, we were thrown back almost entirely upon ourselves and the record, and presently we began to live in a state of siege. I don't propose to deal in detail with the year that followed. It is a drawn-out story of decay, a long, cold winter during which the water lapped into the streets faster than what we expected, a time when the armed bands rode the streets in search of untouched food stores, and at any hour of the day or night one was apt to hear a rattle of shot as 2 gangs met. We ourselves had little trouble. It was as if, after a few attempts to raid us, word had gone round that we were ready to defend, and with so many other stores raidable at little or no risk, we might as well be left until later. When the warmer weather came, there were noticeably fewer people to be seen. Most of them, rather than face another winter in a city by now largely plundered of food and beginning to suffer epidemics of lack of fresh water and drainage, were filtered out into the country, and the shootings that we heard were usually distant. Our own numbers had been depleted too. Out of the original 65, we were now reduced to 25, the rest having gone off in parties by helicopter as the national focus became more settled in Yorkshire. From having been a center, we had declined to the state of an outpost maintained for prestige. Phyllis and I discussed whether we should apply to go, but from the description of conditions that we pried out of the helicopter pilot and his crew, the EBC headquarters sounded congested and unattractive, so we decided to stay for a little while longer. At any rate, we were by no means uncomfortable where we were, and the fewer of us that were left in the London era, the more space and supplies we had. In late spring, we learned that a decree had merged us with our tribal, putting all radio communications into direct government control. It was a broadcasting house lot that were moved out by a swift airlift since the premises were vulnerable, while ours were already in prepared state, and the 1 or 2 BBC men who stayed were notably joined us. News reached us mainly by 2 channels: a private link with EBC, which was moderately honest, though discreet, and broadcasts which, no matter where they came from, were puffed with patently dishonest optimism. We became very tired and cynical about them, as, I imagine, did everyone else, but they still kept on. Every country, it seemed, was meeting and rising above the disaster with a resolution which did honor to the traditions of its people. By midsummer, and a cold midsummer it was, the town had become very quiet. The gangs had gone, only the obstinate individuals remained. There were, without doubt, quite numerous, but in 20,000 streets they seemed sparse, and they were not yet desperate. It is possible to go about in relative safety, though wise to carry a gun. The water had risen further in the time than any of the estimates had supposed. Highest tide now reached the 50-foot level. The flood line was north of Hammersmith and included most of Kensington. It lay along the south side of Hyde Park, then to the south of Piccadilly, across Trafalgar Square, along the Strand and Fleet Street, then ran northeast up the west side of the Lea Valley of the city. Only the high ground about St. Paul's was still untouched. In the south it pushed across Barnes, Battersea, Southwark, most of Dartford, and the lower part of Greenwich. One day we walked down to Trafalgar Square. The tide was in, and the water reached near the top of the wall on the northern side, below the National Gallery. We leaned on the balustrade, looking at the water washing around Landseer's lions, wondering what Nelson would think of the view his statue was getting now. Close to our feet, the edge of the flood was fringed away with scum and fascinatingly varied collection of flotsam. Further away, fountains, lamp posts, traffic lights, and statues thrust up here and there. On the far side and down as much as we could see of Whitehall, the surface was smooth as a canal. A few trees still stood, and in them sparrows chattered. Starlings had not yet deserted St. Martin's Church, but the pigeons were all gone, and on many of their customary perches gulls stood instead. We surveyed the scene and listened to the slip-slop of the water in the silence for some minutes. Then I asked, didn't somebody or other once say, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper? Phyllis looked shocked. Somebody or other, she exclaimed. That was Mr. Elliot. Well, it certainly looks as if he had the idea that time, I said. Presently, Phyllis remarked, I thought I was through a phase now, Mike. Such a long time it kept on seeming that something could be done to save the world we're used to. If we only could find out what. As soon as I think I'll be able to feel, well, let's go on. How can we make the best of what's left? All the same, I wouldn't say that coming to places like this does me any good. There aren't any places like this. Was, one of the uniques. That's the trouble. And it's a bit more than dead, but not yet ready for a museum. Soon, perhaps, we may be able to feel, lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nova entire. Soon, but not quite yet. There was a pause. It lengthened. Mike, she said suddenly, let's go away from here now. I nodded. It might be better. We'll have to get a little tougher yet, darling, I'm afraid. She took my arm and we started to walk westward. Halfway to the corner of the square, we paused at the sound of a motor. It seemed, and probably, to come from the south side. We waited while it drew closer. Presently, out from an admirably arched swept a speedboat. It turned in a sharp arc and sped way down Whitehall, leaving the ripple of its weight slopping through the windows of August government office. Very pretty, I said. There can't be many of us who have accomplished that in one of our waking moments. Phyllis gazed along the widening ripples and abruptly became practical again. I think we'd better see if we can't find one of those, she said. It might come in useful later on. The rate of rise continued to increase. By the end of the summer, the level was up another 8 or 9 feet. The weather was vile and even colder than it had been at the same time the previous year. One of us had applied for transfer, and by mid-September we were down to 16. Even Freddie Whittier had announced that he was sick and tired of wasting his time like a shipwrecked sailor, and was going to see whether he could not find some useful work to do. When the helicopter whisked him and his wife away, they left us reconsidering our own position once more. Our task of composing Never Say Die material on the theme that we spoke from, and for the heart of an empire bloody but still unbowed, was supposed to, we knew, to have stabilizing value even now, but we doubted it. Too many people were whistling the same tune in the same dark. A night or two before the Whittiers left, we had a late party where someone, in small hours, had tuned in a New York transmitter. A man and a woman on the Empire State Building were describing the scene. The picture they evoked of the towers of Manhattan standing like frozen sentinels in the moonlight, while the glittering water lapped at their lower walls, was masterly, almost lyrically beautiful. Nevertheless, it failed in its purpose. In our minds, we could see those shining towers. They were not sentinels, they were tombstones. It made us feel that we were even less accomplished at disguising our own tombstones, that it was time to pull out of our refuge and find more useful work. Our last words to Freddie were that we would very likely be following him before long. We had still, however, not reached the point of making a definite application when he called us up on the rink a couple of weeks later. After the greetings, he said, "This is a curious social, Mike. It is disinterested advice to those contemplating a leap from the frying pan. Don't." "Oh," I said, "what's the trouble?" "I'll tell you this. I'd have an application in for getting back to you right now, if only I could not have made my reasons for getting out so damn convincing. I mean that. Hang on there, both of you." "But," I began. "Wait a minute," he told me. Presently his voice came again. "Okay, no monitor on this, I think. Listen, Mike, we're overcrowded, underfed, and in one hell of a mess. Supplies are all kinds of way down, so is morale. The atmosphere is like a lot of piano strings. We're living virtually in a state of siege here, and if it doesn't turn into an active civil war in a few weeks, it'll be a miracle. People outside are far worse off than we are, but seemingly nothing will convince them that we aren't living on the fat of the land. For God's sake, keep this under your hat, but stay where you are, for Phil's sake, if not your own." I thought quickly. If it's as bad as that, Freddie, and you're doing no good, why not get back here on the next helicopter? Either smuggle aboard, or maybe we could offer the pilot a few things you'd like. "All right. There certainly isn't any use for us here. I don't know why they'd let us come along. I'll work on that. Look for us next flight. Meanwhile, good luck to both of you." "Good luck to you, Freddie, and love to Lynn, and our respects to Barker, if he's there and nobody's slaughtered him yet. Old Barker's here. He's now got a theory that won't go much over 125 feet and seems to think that's good news. Well, considering he's Barker, it might be a lot worse. Bye. We'll be looking forward to seeing you." We were discreet. We said no more than what we had heard. The Yorkshire place was already crowded, so we were staying. A couple who had decided to leave on the next flight changed their minds too. We waited for the helicopter to bring Freddie back. The day after it was due, we were still waiting. We got through on the link. It had no news except that it had left on schedule. I asked about Freddie and Lynn. No one seemed to know where they were. There was never any news of that helicopter. They said they had another that they could send. The cold summer drew into a colder autumn. A rumor reached us that the sea tanks were appearing again for the first time since the waters began to rise. As the only people present who had had personal contact with them, we assumed the status of experts, though almost the only advice we could give was always to lower a sharp knife and in such a position that it could be reached for a quick slash by either hand. But the sea tanks must have found the hunting for and almost deserted streets in London, for presently we heard no more of them. Per the radio, however, we learned that it was not so in some other parts. The reports soon of their reappearance in many places were not only the new shorelines, but the collapse of the organization made it difficult to destroy them and effectively discouraging numbers. Meanwhile, there were worse trouble. Overnight, the combined EBC and BBC transmitters abandoned all pretense of calm confidence. When we looked at the message transmitted to us with radiation simultaneously with all of the stations, we knew that Freddie had been right. It was a call to all loyal citizens to support their legally elected government against any attempts that might be made to overthrow it by force, and the way in which it was put left no doubt that such an attempt was already being made. The thing was a sorry mixture of exhortation, threats, and pleas, which wound up with just a long note of confidence. The note had sounded in Spain and then in France, when the words must be said through speaker and listener alike knew that the end was near. The best reader in the service could not have given it the ring of conviction. The link could not, or would not, clarify the situation for us. Firing was going on, they said. Some armed bands were attempting to break into the administration area. The military had the situation in hand and would clear up the trouble shortly. The broadcast was simply to discourage exaggerated rumors and restore confidence in the government. He said that neither what they were telling us nor the message itself inspired us personally with any confidence whatsoever, and we should like to know what was really going on. They went all official, Bert told. 24 hours later, in the middle of dictating for our radiation and another expression of confidence, the link broke off abruptly. It never worked again. Until one gets used to it, the situation of being able to hear voices from all over the world, but none which tells what is happening in one's own country, is odd. We picked up inquiries about our silence from America, Canada, Australia, Kenya. We radiated at the full power of our transmitter what little we knew, and could later hear it being relayed by foreign stations, but we ourselves were far from understanding what had happened. Even if the headquarters of both systems in Yorkshire had been overrun, as it would appear, there should have been stations still on the air independently in Scotland and Northern Ireland at least, even if they were no better informed than ourselves. Yet a week went by, and still there was no sound from them. The rest of the world appeared to be too busy keeping a mask on its own troubles to bother about us any more, though one time we did hear a voice speaking with historical dispassion of l'accoutrement de l'enjouteur. The word accoutrement was not very familiar to me, but it had a horrible final sound. I totally butchered it. Sorry, French people. The winter closed in. One noticed how few people there were to be seen in the streets now, compared with a year ago. Often it was possible to walk a mile without seeing anyone at all. How those who did remain were living, we could not say. Presumably they had all caches of looted stores that supported them and their families, and obviously it was no matter for the closer inquiry. One noticed also how many of those one did see had taken to carrying weapons as a matter of course. We ourselves adopted the habit of carrying them, guns, not rifles, slung over our shoulders, though less with any expectation of needing them than to discourage the occasion for their need from arising. There was a kind of wary preparedness which was still some distance from instinctive hostility. Chance met men still passed on gossip and rumors, and sometimes hard news of a local crime. It is by such means that we learned of a quite definitely hostile ring now in existence around London, how the surrounding district had somehow formed themselves into miniature independent states and forbidden entry after driving out many who had come there as refugees, how those who did try to cross the border into one of those communities were fired upon without question. In the new year, the sense of things pressing in upon us grew stronger. The high tide mark was now close to the 75-foot level. The weather was abominable and icy cold. There seemed to be scarcely a night when there was not a gale blowing from the southwest. It became rarer than ever to see anyone in the streets, though when the wind did drop for a time, the view from the roof showed a surprising number of chimneys smoking. Mostly it was wood smoke, furniture and fitments burning, I suppose, for the coal store and power stations and railway yards had all disappeared the previous winter. From a purely practical point of view, I doubt whether anyone in the country was more favored or as secure as our food. Food originally supplied, together with that acquired later, made a store which should last 16 people for some years. There was an immense reserve of diesel oil and petrol too. Materially, we were better off than we had been a year ago when there were more of us. But we had learned, as many had before us, about the bread alone factor. One needed more than adequate food. The sense of desolation began to weigh more heavily still when, at the end of February, the water lapped over our doorsteps for the first time, and the building was filled with the sound of it cascading into the basement. Some of the party grew more worried. "It can't come much very higher, surely. 100 feet is the limit, isn't it?" they were saying. There wasn't much good being falsely reassuring. We could do little more than to repeat what Barker had said, but it was a guess. No one had known within a wide limit how much ice there was in the Antarctic. No one was quite sure how much of the northern areas that appeared to be solid land tundra was in fact simply a deposit on a fountain of ancient ice. We just had not known enough about it. The only consolation was that Barker now seemed to think, for some reason, they would not rise above 125 feet, which should leave our area still intact. Nevertheless, it required fortitude to find reassurance in that thought as one lay in bed at night, listening to the echoing splash of the wavelets that the wind was driving along Oxford. One bright morning in May, a sunny, though not warm morning, I missed Phyllis. Inquiries eventually led me onto the roof in search of her. I found her in the southwest corner, gazing towards the trees that dotted the lake which had been Hyde Park, and crying. I leaned on the parapet beside her and put an arm around her. Presently she stopped crying, dabbed her eyes and nose, and said, "Haven't been able to get tough after all. I don't think I can stand this much longer, Mike. Take me away, please." "Where is there to go?" "If we could go," I said. "Cottage, Mike. It wouldn't be so bad there, in the country. There'd be things growing, not everywhere dying like this." There isn't any hope here. We might as well jump over the wall here if there is no hope at all. I thought about it for some moments. But even if we could get there, we'd have to live, I pointed out. We'd need food and fuel and things. There's, she began, and then hesitated and changed her mind. Have to keep us going for a time until we can grow things. And there'd be fish and plenty of wreckage for fuel. We could make out somehow. It'd be hard, but Mike, I can't stay in the cemetery any longer. I can't. Look at it, Mike. Look at it. We never did anything to deserve all this. Most of us weren't very good, but we weren't bad enough for this, surely, and not to have a chance. If it had only been something we could fight, but just to be drowned and starved and forced into destroying one another to live, and by things nobody has ever seen, living in one place we can't get at them. Some of us are going to get through the stage, of course, the tough ones, but what are the things down there going to do then? Sometimes I dream of them lying down in those deep dark valleys, and sometimes they look like monstrous squids or huge slugs. Other times that they were great clouds of luminous cells hanging there in rocky chasms. I don't suppose that we'll ever know what they really look like, but whatever it is, they're there all the time, thinking and plotting what they do to finish us off right now, so that everything will be there. Sometimes, in spite of Bacher, I think perhaps it is the things themselves that are inside the seed tanks. If only we could capture one and examine it, we should know how to fight them, at last. Several times I've dreamed that we have found one and managed to discover what make it work. Nobody believes us but Bacher, but we have told him we've given him an idea for a wonderful new weapon which finished them all off. I know it sounds very silly, but it's wonderful in the dream, and I wake up feeling as if we saved the world from a nightmare. And then I hear the sound of the water slap against the walls in the street, and I know it isn't finished. It's just going on and on and on. I can't stand it here anymore, Mike. I shall go mad if I have to sit here and do nothing any longer while a great city dies by inches all around me. It'd be different in Cornwall, anywhere in the country. I'd rather have to work night and day to keep alive than just go on like this. I think I'd rather die trying to get away than face another winter like that. I had not realized it was as bad as that. It wasn't a thing to be argued about. All right, darling, we'll go. Everything we could hear warned us against attempting to get away by normal means. We told the belts where everything had been raised to give clear fields of fire. Then were booby traps and alarms as well as guards. Everything beyond those belts was said to be based on cold calculation of the number each autonomous district would support. Natives of the districts had banded together and turned out the refugees and the useless on to the lower ground where they had to shift for themselves. In each of the areas there was the acute awareness that another mouth to feed and increase the shortage for all. Any stranger who did manage to sneak in could not hope to remain unnoticed for long, and his treatment was ruthless when he was discovered. Survival demanded it. So it looked as though our own survival demanded that we should try some other way. The chance by water along inlets that must be constantly widening and reaching further looked better, and but for the luck of our finding that sturdy little motorboat, the Midge, I don't know what would happen to us. It came to us through a rather ghastly accident of the owners being shot trying to escape from Wyndham. Ted Jarvie found it and brought it to us, knowing that we'd been searching futilely for weeks for just such a boat. An uneasy feeling that some of the others might wish to get away, for us to come with us to turn out to be baseless. Without exception, they considered us crazy. Most of them contrived to take one of us aside at some time or another to point out the willful improvidence of giving up warm quarters to make a certainly cold and probably dangerous journey to a certainly worse and probably intolerable condition. They helped to fuel and store the Midge until she was inches lower in the water, but not one of them could have been bribed to set out with us. Our progress down the river was cautious and slow, and we had no intention of letting the journey be more dangerous than necessary. Our main recurrent problem was where to lay up for the night. We were sharply conscious of our probable fate as trespassers, and also of the fact that Midge, with her contents, was tempting booty. Our usual anchorage was in the sheltered streets of some flooded town. Several times when it was blowing hard, we'd lay up in such places for several days. Fresh water, which we had expected to be the main problem, turned out to be not difficult. One could almost always find some still in the tanks and the roof spaces of a partially submerged house. Overall, the trip, which used to clock at 268.8 or .9 by road, took us slightly over a month to make. Round the corner and into the channel, the white cliffs looked so normal from the water that the flooding was hard to believe, until we looked more closely at the gaps where the town should have been. A little later, we were right out of the normal before we began to see our first iceberg. We approached the end of the journey with caution. From what we had been able to observe on the coast, we came along, there were often embankments of the shacks on higher ground. Where the land rose steeply, there were often towns and villages where the higher houses were still occupied, though the lower were submerged. What kind of conditions we might find at Penland in general, and the Rose Cottage in particular, we had no idea. I took the Midge carefully into the Helford River, with shotguns lying to hand. Here and there, a few people on the hillside stopped to look down at us, but they neither shot nor waved. It was only later that we found that they had taken her to be one of the few local boats that still had the fuel to run. We turned north from the main river, with the water now close on the 100-foot level, and the multiplication of waterways was confusing. We lost our way half a dozen times before we rounded a corner on an entirely new inlet and found ourselves looking up a familiar steep hillside at the cottage above us. People had been there, several lots of them, I should think, but though the disorder was considerable, the damage was not great. It was evidently the consumables they had been after chiefly. Standbys had vanished from the larder to be the last bottle of sauce and packet of pepper. The drum of oil, the candles, and the small store of coal were gone too. Phyllis gave a quick look over the debris and then disappeared down the cellar steps. We emerged in a moment and ran out to the arbor she had built in the garden. Through the window, I saw her examining the floor of it carefully. Presently she came back. "That's all right, thank goodness," she said. It did not seem a moment for great concern about arbors. What's all right?" I inquired. "The food," she said. "I didn't want to tell you about it until I knew it. It would have been too bitterly disappointing if it had gone." "What food?" I asked bewilderingly. "You're not much intuition, have you, Mike? Did you really think that someone like me would be doing all that bricklaying just for fun? I walled off half the cellar full of stuff, and there's a lot of under the arbor, too." I stared at her. "Do you mean to say—" "But that was ages ago, before the flooding even began." "But not before they began sinking ships so fast. It seemed to me that it'd be a good thing to lay in stores before things got difficult, because it could, quite obviously, was going to get difficult later. I thought it would only be sensible to have reserve here just in case. Only it was no good telling you because I knew you'd just get stuffy about it." I sat down and regarded her. "Stuffy?" I inquired. "Well, there are some people who seem to think it's more ethical to pay black market prices than to take sensible precautions." "Oh," I said, "so you bricked it in yourself?" "Well, I didn't want anybody local to know, so the only way was to do it myself. As it happened, the food airlift was much better organized than one could have expected, so we didn't need it. But it will come in useful now." "How much?" I asked. He considered. "I'm not quite sure, but there's a whole big truckload down there, and there's all the stuff we got in the Midge, too." I could see, and do see, several angles to this thing, but it would have been curiously ungrateful to mention them just then, so I let it rest, and we busied ourselves with tidying up and making plans. It did not take us long to understand why the cottage had been abandoned. One had only climbed to its crest to see that our hill was destined to become an island, and within a few weeks, two crawling inlets joined together behind us and made it one. The pattern of events we found had been much the same here as in other parts, except that there was no influx, the movement had been away. First, there was the cautious retreat as the water began to rise, later the panicky rush to stake a claim on the higher ground while there was still a chance. Those who remain, and still remain, are the mixture of the obstinate, the tardy, and the ever-hopeful who had been saying since the beginning that tomorrow or maybe the next day the water will cease. A state of feud between those who stayed and those who shifted was well established. The uplanders will allow no newcomers into their strictly rationed territory. The lowlanders carried guns and set traps to discourage raids on their fields. It is said, though I do not know with how much truth, the conditions here are good compared with Devon and places further east. For once the inhabitants of the lower ground had been driven out of their homes and set on the move, very many of them decided to keep on going until they should reach the lush country beyond the moors. There are fearsome tales about the defensive warfare against starving gangs that goes on in Devon, Somerset, and Dorset, but here one hears shooting only occasionally, and then on a small scale. The completeness of our isolation has been one of the difficult things to bear. The radio set, which might have told us something of how the rest of the world, not our own country, was faring, failed a few days after we arrived, and we have needed a means of testing it and replacing the parts. Our island offers little temptation, so we have not been molested. The people about here grew enough food last summer to keep themselves going, as well as fish, which are plentiful. Our status is not entirely that of strangers, and we've been careful to make no demands or requests. I imagine we are thought to be existing on fish and what stores we had avoid the midge, and that what can be left of it now is not worth the trouble of raid on us. It might have been different had the crops been fuller last summer. I started this account at the beginning of November. It is now the end of January. Water continued to rise slightly, but since about Christmas there seems to have been no increase in temperature. We are hoping that it's reached its limit. There are still icebergs out in the channel, but there are fewer. There are still not infrequent raids by sea tanks, sometimes single, but more usually in fours or fives. But as a rule, they are more of a nuisance than a danger. People living close to the sea keep a rota of watchers who will be alarmed. Sea tanks apparently don't like climbing, seldom venture more than a quarter of a mile away from the water's edge, and when they find no victims, they soon go away. By far the worst thing to face has been the cold of the winter. Even making allowance for the difference in our circumstances, it seemed a great deal colder than the last. The inlet below us has been frozen over many weeks, and in calm weather the sea itself is frozen well out from the shore. But mostly it has not been calm weather. For days on end there have been gales when everything is covered with ice and freight carried inland. We're lucky in being sheltered from the full force of the southwest, but it is bad enough. Heaven knows what life must be like in the encampments up on the moors when these blizzards fall. We have decided that when the summer comes, we shall try to get away. We shall aim south and search somewhere warmer. We could probably last out here another winter, but it would leave us less provision and less fit to face the journey than we shall have to make sometime. It is possible, we think, that in one of those left of Plymouth or Devonport we may still be able to find some for the engine. But in any case, we shall rig a mast, and if we are warned off, and no fuel to be found, then we shall try to make it under sail. Where to? We don't know yet. Somewhere warmer. Perhaps we shall find only bullets before we try to land, but even that would be better than slow starvation and bitter cold. And Phyllis agrees. We'll be taking a long shot, Watson. A very long shot, she says. But after all, what is the good of having been given so much luck if you don't go on using it? 4th of May. We shall not be going south. This mist will not be left here in a tin box on the chance of someone finding it some day. It will go with us. And here is why. 2 days ago we sighted the first aircraft that we have seen since we came here, some time before then. A helicopter that came trembling along the coast and then turned inland to pass along our own inlet. We were down by the rudder, working to get the midge ready for her trip. There was a distant buzzing, and this craft came bumbling along right toward us. We looked up at it, shading our eyes. It was against the sun, but I could make out the RAF circle on its side, and I thought I could see someone waving from the cabin. I waved my hand. Phyllis waved her paintbrush. We watched it plow along to our left and then turn north. It appeared behind our hill. We looked at one another as the sound of the engine dwindled. We did not speak. I didn't know how it took Phyllis, but it made me feel a bit queer. I never thought to find myself in a situation where the throb of an airplane engine would be a kind of nostalgic music in my ears. Then I realized that the sound was not getting further away. The craft reappeared around the other side of the hill. Apparently it had been giving our island a looking over. We watched it steady up and then begin to lower towards the curve of the hill that sheltered us. I dropped my screwdriver and Phyllis her paintbrush, and we started to run uphill toward it. It came down lower, but obviously it was not going to take the risk of landing among the stones in the heather. While it hung there, a door in the side opened. The bundle dropped out and bounced on the heather, and then came a rope ladder, unrolling as it fell. A figure began to climb down the ladder, negotiating it carefully. The helicopter was drifting slowly across the top of the hill, and presently the man dangling on the ladder was hidden from our sight as we panted upward. We were still some little way from the top when the machine rose and sheered off over our heads, with the ladder being pulled up by someone inside. We kept on struggling up the slope. Presently we reached a point from which we were able to see a darkly clad figure sitting in the heather, apparently exploring itself for breakfast. It's, Phyllis began. It is! It's Parker! She cried, and sped recklessly over the rough ground. By the time I got there, she was on her knees beside him, with both her arms twined around his neck, crying hard. He was patting her shoulder involuntarily. He held out his other hand to me as I came up. I took it in both of mine, and I felt not far from weeping myself. He was Barker, all right, and looking scarcely changed from the last time I'd seen him. There did not seem to be much to say for the moment, except, "Are you all right? Have you hurt yourself?" "Only a bit shaken up, nothing broken, but there seems to be more skill in it than I'd have thought." Phyllis raised her head to tell him, "You never ought to tried it, A.B. You might have killed yourself." Then put it back and went on crying comfortably. Barker looked at the tussle of hair on his shoulder for some thoughtful seconds, and then up at me, inquiring. I shook my head. "Others have had her face a lot worse, but it has been lonely and very depressing," I told him. He nodded and patted Phyllis's shoulder. Presently she began to get more control of herself. Barker waited a little longer, then he remarked, "If you, sir, would care to remove your wife just for a moment, I'd like to find out if I'm able to stand." He could. "Nothing but a bump and a bruise or two," he announced. "A lot luckier than you deserve," Phyllis told him severely. "It was a perfectly ridiculous thing to do at your age." "Just what was I thinking when I was about halfway down?" he agreed. Phyllis's lips were still trembling as she looked at him. "Oh, A.B., it's wonderful to see you again. I still can't believe it." He put one arm around her shoulders and linked his other into mine. "I'm hungry," he announced practically. "Somewhere around here is a parcel of food that we dropped." Went down to the cottage. Phyllis chattering like mad all the way, except for the pauses in which she stopped to look at Barker and convince herself that he was really there. When he arrived, she disappeared into the kitchen. Barker sat down cautiously. "There should be drinks now, but they were finished some time ago," he told him sadly. He pulled out a large flask, regarded a severe dent in it for a moment. Well, let's hope it gets more comfortable going up than coming down." Poured whiskey into 3 glasses and summoned Phyllis. "Here's to recovery," he said. We drank. "And now," I said, "since nothing in our experience has been more unlikely than you descending from the skies on a trapeze, we'd like an explanation." "That wasn't in the plan. When I found out from the London people that you had set out for Cornwall, I guessed that this is where you'd be, if you had made it. So when I was able to, I came to take a look. But the pilot didn't like your bit of terrain at all. I wouldn't risk landing with the machine. So I said I'd go down and they could buzz off to somewhere they could land and come back to pick me up 3 hours' time." "Oh," I said rather flatly. Phyllis just stared at him. "It's all very well you looking at it that, but I'd have been with you before this if you'd stayed where you were. Why didn't you? You got us down, A.B. We thought you died when the Harrogate place was overrun. The Tears never came back. Blink went dead. Helicopters stopped coming. There wasn't a British station to be heard on the air, and after a bit it looked as if things really had come to a finish. So we came away. Even rats prefer to die in the open." Phyllis got up, stared, and started to lay the table. "I don't think you would have quietly stayed there waiting for an inevitable end either, A.B." said. Barker shook his head. "Oh, ye of little faith. This isn't Noah's world, you know. The 20th century isn't a thing to be pushed over quite as easily as all that. The patient is still in great condition. He has been very, very sick indeed, and he has lost a tragic lot of blood, but he's going to recover. Oh, yes, he's going to recover all right. You'll see." He looked out the window at the water spread over the former fields, at the new arms of the sea running back into the land, at the houses that had been homes and now were washed through by every tide. "How?" I asked. "It isn't going to be easy, but it's going to be done. We lost a great deal of our best land, but the water hasn't risen any more in the last 6 months, and we reckon that we might be able to grow more than enough to feed 5 million people once we get organized." 5 million? I repeated. "That's the rough estimate of the present population. Not much more than a guess, readily, of course." "But it was something like 46 millions, I exclaimed. That was the side that Phyllis and I had avoided talking about, or thinking about more than we could help. In our more depressed moments I had, I fancy, a vague idea that in the course of time there'd be few survivors living in barbarism, but I had never considered it in figures. How did it happen? We knew they were fighting, of course, but this? Some were killed in the fighting, and of course there were places where a lot were cut off and drowned, but That doesn't really account for more than a small percentage. No, it's been pneumonia mostly that has done the damage. Undernourishment and exposure through 3 bitter winters, with every dose of flu, every cold leading to pneumonia. No medical services, no drugs, no communications, nothing to be done about it. Drugged. But AB, Phyllis reminded him, we just drank to recovery. Recovery? With 9 out of 10 gone? He looked steadily at her and nodded. Certainly, he said, confident. 5 million can still be a nation. Why, damn it, there were no more of us than that in the time of First Elizabeth. We made ourselves count then, and by God, we can do it again. Whether it means working. I'm here. There's a job for you two. Job? Said Phyllis blankly. Yes, and it won't be putting across soaps and cheeses this time. It'll be selling morale. So the sooner you both start brushing up your own morale, the better. Just wait a minute. I can see this going to need some explanation, said Phyllis. She fetched the meal, and we drew our chairs up to the table. All right, A.B., she said. I know you never allow mere eating to interfere with talking. Let's have it. Very well, said Walker. Now imagine a country which is nothing but small groups and independent communities scattered all over the place. All communications gone, nearly all of them barricaded off for defense, scarcely anyone with any idea what may be going on even a mile or two outside its area. Well, now what have you got to do to get a condition like that in working order again? First, I think you got to find your way into these tight, isolated pockets so that you can break them up. To do that, you have to first establish some kind of central authority, then to let the people know that there is a central authority, and give them confidence in it. If you want to start parties and groups, it will be the local representations of the central authority. And how do you reach them? Well, you just start talking to them and telling them by radio. You find a factory and start working or turning out small radio receivers and batteries that you can drop from the air. When you can follow that up with radio transmitter sets to give you two-way communication with larger groups first, and then smaller ones. Break down the isolation and the sentiment. When the group begins to hear what other groups are doing, self-confidence begins to revive. There's a feeling a hand held again to give them hope. They begin to feel there's something to work for. Then one lot begins to cooperate with and trade with the lot next door. Then you have started something indeed. It is a job our ancestors had to do with generations of men on horseback. By radio, we ought to be able to make a thundering good start on it in a couple of years. But there will have to be staff. There will have to be people who know how to put across what might need to be put across. So what do you say? Phyllis went on staring at her plate for some moments, and then she looked, shiny-eyed at Walker, with her hand on his. A.B., he said shakily, have you ever thought that you're nearly dead, and then had a sudden shot of adrenaline? He leaned across the corner of the table and kissed him on the cheek. Adrenaline, I said. Doesn't take one quite the same way, but I support Phyllis. I very heartily subscribe. Makes me feel more drunk than alcohol ever did, said Phyllis. Fine, said Walker. Then you'd better get busy with packing up. We'll send a bigger helicopter to take you and your baggage off in 3 days' time. And don't leave any food behind. It's going to be a long time yet before we can afford to waste any of that. He went on explaining and giving instructions, but I doubt whether either of us heard much of it. Then, somehow, he was telling us how he and a few others escaped after attack on Harrogate, but there were little rooms in our mind for that either, just then. For myself, at any rate, quite an hour must have passed before I came out of the daze with sudden change of prospects and inspired. Then, however, I did get round to realizing that we were being a bit parochial. The operation of unfreezing the masses of locked water might have been carried to a point where it menaced us to no further, but that did not mean that it would not be followed by some new and perhaps equally devastating form of attack. As far as we knew, the true source of all our troubles was still lurking safely out of reach of our steps. I put the point to Walker. He smiled. I don't think I've ever been called an unbridled optimist. I shouldn't think so, agreed Phyllis. So, Walker went on, I am hoping it will carry some weight when I say that to me the outlook is distinctly hopeful. There have been plenty of disappointments, of course, and there may be more, but it does look as if, for the present at any rate, we have got hold of something which is too much for our xenobaphic friends. What, without these cautious qualifications, would it be? I asked. Ultrasonics, exclaimed. I stared at him. But they've tried ultrasonics half a dozen times at least. I can distinctly remember. Mike, darling, just shut up. There's a love, said my devoted wife. She turned to Walker. How have they done, A.B.? she she asked him. Well, it's well enough known that certain ultrasonic waves in water will kill fish and other creatures. So there were a lot of people who said all along that they're very likely to be the right answer to the bathies, but obviously not with the wave initiator working on the surface at the range of 5 miles or so. The problem was to get the ultrasonic emitter down there close enough for it to do damage. You couldn't just let it down because its cable would be electrified or cut, and judged by precedent, that would happen long before it got anywhere like deep enough to be useful. But now the Japs seem to have found the answer. Very ingenious people, the Japs, and in their more sociable moments, a credit to science. So far, we have only had a great general description by radio of their device, but it seems to be a type of self-propelled sphere which cruises slowly along, emitting ultrasonic waves of great intensity. But the really clever thing about this is, it not only produces lethal waves, it makes uses of them themselves on the principle of an echo sounder and steers by them. That is to say, you could fix it to steer off from any obstacle when it receives an echo from it at a given distance. See the idea? Set a flock of these things from a clearance of, say, 200 feet and start them going at the end of a narrow deep. Then they'll cruise along, keeping 200 feet from the bottom, 200 feet from the sides of the deep, 200 feet from any obstruction, 200 feet clear of one another, and turning out a lethal ultrasonic wave as they go. That's just a simple principle of the things. Jap's real triumph has been not only been able to build them, but have them built tough enough to withstand the pressure. None of it sounds the least simple to me, Phyllis told him. The important point is, do the things really work? Well, the Japs claim they do, and they're not going to be much object in lying about it. They say they cleared a couple of small deeps already. Large masses of organic jelly came up, but they've not been able to make much of that because the pressure change has broken it up and decomposed quickly in sunlight. But afterward, they tested the cables right down to the bottom and nothing happened. They're working on other small deeps now until they got enough gear to tackle bigger ones. They've flown plans and things over to the States and the Americans who have not been hit nearly as badly as we have in this small island. They're going to put them into production, so that's a testimony. It's bound to take some time for them to get busy on a really large scale. However, that isn't our affair for the moment. We haven't any important deeps near us. Anyway, it's going to be some time before we can produce anything more than immediate necessity. We were very badly overcrowded on this island, and we're paid for it heavily. We shall have to take steps to see that that doesn't happen again. Phyllis frowned. A.B., she said, I had to tell you before about your habit of going just one step farther than people are willing to follow you. She told us severely. Barker grinned. Perhaps it's lucky this one's not going to come up in my time, he admitted. The three of us sat in Phyllis's arbor, looking out at the view that has changed so greatly in so short a time. For a while, none of us spoke. I stole a sidelong glance at Phyllis. She was looking as though she had just seen a beauty treatment. I'm coming to life again, Mike, she said. There's something to live for. I felt like that, too. But as I looked out over the blue sea, still set with a few glistening birds, I added, all the same, it isn't going to be any picnic. There's this ghastly climate, and when I think of the winters... Oh, A.B. said, research is being done on that now, and the reports indicate that the water will warm up gradually. As a matter of fact, he said, chuckling, now the ice is gone, we may have an even better climate than before in 3 or 4 years' time. We went on sitting there, and finally Phyllis spoke again. I was just thinking, nothing is really new, is it? Once upon a time, there was a great plain, covered with forests and full of wild animals. I expect some of our ancestors used to live there and hunt there and make love there. Then, one day the water came up and drowned it all, and there was the North Sea. I think we have been here before, and we've gotten through that time. We were silent for a while, then Barker looked at his watch and said, that machine will be coming back soon. I'd better make ready for my death-defying act. I wish you wouldn't, A.B., Phyllis told him. Can't you just let them take a message and stay here with us until the big helicopter comes? He shook his head. Can't spare the time. I'm really playing truant as it is. Only I thought I'd like to be the one to give you two the news. Don't you worry, my dear. The old man's not too dottery to climb a rope ladder yet. Good as his word. When the machine descended over the crest of the hill, he caught the trailing ladder I drove it to, clung to it a moment, and then began to climb. Presently, arms reached down to help him aboard. turned to the doorway to wave to us. Things speeded up, started to climb. But soon, there was only a speck, vanished in the distance. And that, my friends, is how the world ends. Not with a bang, but a very long, very cold bath. Wyndham's Phase 3 shows us that the master, Hitchcock, knew exactly what he was doing when he chose this story to cap off his collection. It's the dread of the inevitable. The aliens are gone, destroyed by a frequency they couldn't handle, but they won the long game. The map is redrawn, London is a reef, and humanity, well, we're still here, just a lot soggier and hopefully a little humbler. That concludes Series 1 of Shadows from the Master. We've navigated the fire and the floods. I'm gonna find a boat. Or a dry pair of socks. What would you do if the tide never stopped? Tell me in the comments. If your keyboard still works. I'm Felix Lubezki, host for SL Tonight. Good night, and stay dry.
Pixels on skin, glamour in cold. Where to begin? Free to create, free to share, but they claim it, tear it bare. Digital.